Hello, my name is Coach Kev Deneen, and today we're going to review some things that may exist in your everyday life that you may not know, may be leading to shoulder, elbow, or even wrist pain. And with this topic of shoulder, elbow, and wrist pain, the predictable risk factors is maybe a little bit of a clickbait title, but most importantly, the things that we look at from what has been known to cause injuries in the past has always been this concept of what's known as a RSI, or repetitive stress injury. The problem with that is that sometimes the repetitive stress has always been linked to activity. So, for instance, if you're a golfer or a tennis player or a baseball player, the concept has been you are doing too much of that sport to cause, and that's causing injury. It's overwhelming the tissue, and now we have an injury. So you need to stop doing that activity. And because you're stopping the symptoms, right, that have been caused by the increased activity or the tissue not accepting the increased activity, that should go away. But we know that now that may not be the case. And what I mean specifically is that there are other underlying factors that, well, shoot, I didn't think about that. That's going to happen, that kind of reaction to this conversation that we're going to have today. And we're going to talk about lifestyle. We're going to talk about some things that you can do on an everyday basis. Talk about posture. We're going to talk about things that we do, again, on an everyday basis and an every hour basis that we can potentially look at to change the way our bodies may be looking at and or feeling as far as the wrist, elbow, and shoulder is concerned. So, on to arm injuries. So, with the topic of specific movement, I think a lot of people look at, okay, so if it's a young pitcher or baseball player and they had a big tournament last weekend and their elbow now hurts. It's not that past weekend that caused their elbow to all of a sudden have a tendonitis injury. In some instances it is, but it can also be the fact that the wrist or the shoulder wasn't strong enough to handle the demand, and thus the elbow was the intermediary that took on most of the load, or took the load improperly, and the tissue now is what we would say barking. So the reason that this is important is not just because of this photo, but also because while we look at that young baseball player, for instance, and we say, okay, they have elbow pain now after a multi-game weekend at a tournament, and they pitched and threw and whatever, and now they have elbow pain. Well, that sounds like, well, duh. Within the concept of what most people would say to do to prevent it from happening again would be an instance where this woman who is demonstrating, innocently enough, external rotation at the shoulder joint, this would be an exercise that some people would say, hey, you need to do this exercise. This is going to strengthen your external rotators, and it's going to relieve some of that pain at the elbow. But again, here's the thing. When the dog wags the tail or the tail wags the dog, we don't know necessarily what's causing it. So looking at just the rotator cuff and looking at specific movements and identifying specific movements that an athlete may need to participate in, may is probably not as strong of a word as it could be, should be participating in order to look at how we train an athlete and how an athlete needs to be able to function on an everyday basis. So again, specific movements, especially like this poor woman, specific movements, we might want to be really specific about which ones that we're recommending. A little bit more about the shoulder and the elbow. So we're going to review these things, and these are some of the things that you can take home with you. And if, by the way, some of the other concepts that I think and a take home from this is that, if anything, if you back away from this, you'll have a little bit more understanding, hopefully a lot more understanding about how the shoulder works, the rotator cuff muscles, the shoulders, and the concepts that surround it, and why so many physical therapists, coaches, trainers are now maybe looking at the elbow, shoulder, and wrist a little differently today than they were maybe 10, even 20 years ago. So first, we're going to review the rotator cuff muscles. What are they? What do they do? We're going to talk about other upper body muscles and whether they have external or internal rotation capacity. We're going to talk about elbow pain and why hips can sometimes be, if the hips aren't moving as much as they should, how that lack of hip motion may be causing pain elsewhere. And then the other concept that we're going to talk about is how to overcome poor posture, because that's something that we have seen a lot of. So those are the big concepts for today. The rotator cuff muscles in isolation. So there's four, but they don't really tell the whole story. Their subscap, the infraspinatus, teres minor, and the supraspinatus, those are all important, and the how they stabilize the shoulder and the shoulder joint. I like the expression, keep the golf ball on the tee. How they work in relation to the shoulder is very important. And I went to school for sports medicine, have a degree in sports medicine, anatomy and physiology, kinesiology, exercise physiology. They're all very important. This is where, in isolation, these muscles are effective at doing their jobs, internal and external rotation. Here's the problem. They're very, very small. And their capacity for load, if it just comes down to the function of the shoulder, we're doing exercises that only do subscap motion or teres minor, or trying to target these little muscles with very little exercises. We're probably missing the forest for the trees. And I'll explain this, but in short, we probably want to avoid doing very little exercises as part of a rehab or even a training program as it pertains to preventing injury. Now, the argument against that would be, well, that could be the warm-up, in which I would say I agree. The idea behind what should be your warm-up can be some of these exercises that you would find as a prehabilitation exercise. So do some exercises for the subscap, infraspinatus, teres minor, and supraspinatus in different positions. So whether it's the hand above the head, the hand behind the back, and getting different positions. Maybe it's on all fours, maybe it's on a bench, but challenging the rotator cuff muscles and the motions of the rotator cuff in a different way than just with a band and or in isolation. So challenging them in integration. Speaking of integration, important concept is this relation to the muscles that internally and externally rotate the shoulder and the capacity that some of them have. What I mean by that, they're muscles that internally rotate the shoulder, that basically bring the shoulders and round the shoulders forward. That is a very blanket term. That's not how the shoulders work by definition, but just for our intents and for our sake, purposefully, the concept here about the rotation of the shoulder is that the muscles are outnumbering, the internal rotation muscles are outnumbering the external rotation muscles. And that is part of the problem, because when we compound that with a young athlete who may only do push-ups and not do rows, who may do bench presses or shoulder presses and not do chin-ups or pull-ups, and the young athlete may develop and overdevelop the muscles that internally rotate the shoulder without the proper balance, right? And this is maybe on a functional standpoint if they are doing weight training or strength training or some sort of functional training routine, they may get a little more development in the internal rotation muscles and not enough development in the external rotation muscles. And if you look at it on paper and you say, wow, there's 6 muscles, some of them are huge that do internal rotation of the shoulder. So pectoralis major, your chest muscles, your lat dorsi, big back muscles, internally rotates the shoulder, teres major, and the anterior aspect, the front delt. We have a problem that we have to overcome with both awareness of this situation, but also a very specific plan when it comes to overcoming a young athlete and the temptation for them to do those mirror muscles and that old school bodybuilding routine of chest, shoulders, tries multiple days a week. We may want to rethink how that young athlete's training. We may want to rethink how that young athlete is being assessed when it comes to posture and movement. And in addition, this is where supervision from an outside source, sometimes a 10,000-foot view of what the athlete's doing on a weekly, monthly, or yearly basis, is helpful to analyze and look at, hey, this is the next level. And we're going to talk about some of those things that we can do to go to that next level. commonly phrased are these solutions. Let's do external rotation. We're going to strengthen your external rotators. Again, doing that band external rotation, maybe doing different versions of it. You can do it up at 90 degrees, arm at your side. You can do bicep isometrics. You can do isometrics of the shoulder. But these are some of the simplest solutions that you can do. You can even do them today, and to take matters into your own hands, literally. So you're doing the movement and addressing that movement imbalance between the external and internal rotators just from, and we're talking about the shoulder, not necessarily the elbow yet, but talking about the shoulder, we're talking about basically just doing more external rotation than internal rotation. Some people would also say doing more pulls than pushes, although that may not help if you're doing, let's say, just more pull-ups and or rows, because you need to get the elbows out to the side to get a more balanced multiplanar approach to training the upper body. I digress. The other concept that you can have happen today is film yourself doing a workout, doing an exercise, and get feedback on it. I know I have not said no to somebody. And if somebody says, hey, can you look at my form or watch my form, or I'd like to get better at this exercise, or I'd like to fix this, most coaches would be happy. And if not happy, they'd be thrilled to take you through some sort of visual coaching so that you can find out what sort of motor unit recruitment you need to alter, and or what sort of awareness you can have from a third party. So again, getting coach can help any athlete through a difficult phase of we have pain. The last thing, and this is where I think that the most important, the missing ingredient, the secret sauce, the last thing is that we're going to talk about is identifying, this is meaning asking better questions as a practitioner, identifying and eliminating poor habits, okay, and or movements. We talked about some of those movements, getting that feedback, and saying, I liken it to Hansel and Gretel, right, where it's like leaving crumbs for me to find and asking those questions, watching movements, and then you go on this wild goose chase to find out what may be causing the pain and or producing pain. And it could be something that doesn't show up on a movement test. So again, ergonomics in school or work, ergonomics all day in travel, supplement and or sleep and or study. All of these things can be considered factors that could alter someone's pain pattern, whether or not they're sleeping and then recovering from workouts or from games and competitions, whether or not they're traveling and they're in the car for long hours, but not necessarily adjusting posture. These are all things to consider. So there's everything on the table, but most people only take the 1 to 3 hours a day that the young athlete or an athlete is subject to the activity versus the other 167 hours in a week. Well, it's less than that, but the other hours in a week, the majority of the week that they may be subject to poor movement patterns. Specifically, this is important. So when we talk about getting an assessment, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily mean a fancy movement screen, although those exist. It doesn't mean that somebody needs to do a 2-hour movement pattern, pass, fail, that kind of thing. That's not what this means. What this means is that we need to create some sort of connection between the mind and the muscle. And the muscle specifically, for instance, today I had somebody doing what's known as a reverse fly, and they said that the resistance was easy. And I was clarifying, this is the better question, where did you feel it? And they didn't feel it in the right spot. They felt it in their arms. We're going after the shoulders and the muscles between the scapula/shoulder blades. And with a little bit of mind-muscle connection, she was successfully able to feel the exercise very different. And this is where I talk about loading the right tissue. The mind created the connection to the muscle, and we got more out of the exercise than we would have if I didn't ask the question, but also if she didn't trust me to provide me with feedback. So identifying first, but then loading the right muscles. And then in addition, here's the other thing. Tracking is an underutilized and under-celebrated tool that you have in your toolbox to track progress. And whether it's Google Sheets or a notepad or a notebook, tracking what you've done daily, weekly, monthly, those are important metrics. So if you have 3 games this week and none next week, or if you have hours of travel this week and none next week, these are factors that when you look at it on paper, these can contribute to anybody's movement dysfunction. But a lot of people, again, are only going to look at, well, how many practices do they have? How many games do they have? The bigger picture here is tracking things that matter, and our metrics that matter are not just going to be the games and the pitches thrown, but any travel, meals, it could be even steps if they're playing other sports. It could be, again, sleep. We talked about posture, talk about all these things. So there's all sorts of things that can be, again, loading the athlete that we're not necessarily considering. And that's where taking it in as a 10,000 foot view is helpful. The last thing on this sheet is important, and that's to eliminate any fascial or movement interruptions. And what I mean by the fascia is to maybe get a massage or what's known as ART, active release technique, that goes specifically to break up some of the adhesions that you might find in a muscle group. I liken it to untangling the Christmas wires or the Christmas lights in the wires and trying to pull them apart so that you can successfully hang them. The movement concept and eliminating any movement interruptions is that, for instance, if somebody has restrictions at their hips and they're not able to get equal movement in terms of internal external rotation at the hips, then they might be sacrificing and increasing the amount of stress that they're putting on their wrist, elbow, and shoulder complex. So now we have a recipe where everyone's going to look at the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder. But in fact, we have something altogether different where the stress actually was magnified by the fact that their hips don't have the right range of motion. So addressing the hip may eliminate some elbow pain. Can't believe I just said that, but that's the current situation. This is important. And whether you're playing pickleball, whether you're playing tennis, whether you're playing golf, most people do better with motion. Motion is lotion. If you don't use it, you lose it. All those concepts are true. And the concept to embrace, to really look at as far as aging is concerned, as far as different ages, what should my training program be? I'm getting old, I can't do that. The limiting factors for motion happen to be not moving. So if somebody has a shoulder that's tight when they go overhead and they feel pinching, oftentimes it's because they haven't been moving overhead, whether they're not doing lat pull downs, chin ups, or overhead ranges of motion, presses, etc. They stopped moving that joint, and thus everything said, okay, we're just going to shut her down and we're going to restrict motion. And now when you go to put the suitcase in the overhead bin at the age of 45, 50, 55, you're going to ask for assistance because you stopped doing that motion. And I'm just using that as an example, but getting old doesn't have to happen. The surrounding thought, again, motion is lotion, is that the motion that you produce at any joint provides blood flow to the tissues that will keep that joint moving. And so now you can say, well, I have pain when doing that motion. Fine. That's when you address the movement via the things that we're talking about today. So the concept here is that we've talked a little bit about the youth athlete, but the bigger concept is if you look at any athlete, young or old, the young tend to need more stability, and because they have a lot of mobility, whereas the older, maybe they need a little bit more mobility because they've been a little bit more stable in terms of their sitting and or their posture, et cetera. So the concepts here is that the blood flow will lead to more growth as it pertains to range of motion, but also muscle and metabolic health. Let's get some things in your exercise toolkit. So these are rules and things that we're going to follow to stay safe. So number one is it shouldn't hurt. If you have pain with something, you got to get it looked at. You have to get somebody to say, hey, why does this hurt? Can you watch this real quick? This hurts my shoulder or my elbow or my wrist. The other thing, and I talk about this all the time, is we want to approach a level of tolerance and increase that level of tolerance. And then as we increase that level of tolerance, what happens is we're increasing adaptation and we're moving that needle. The problem with going and checking and testing for a threshold all the time is that the stress of that threshold is where we're going to get close to risking injury. So the difference is that the muscles and the body will have a stress response that we're not ready for, and it's going to take longer to recover from that stress of approaching the threshold than approaching tolerance. This usually means our effort. We want to be between an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10, but we don't really want to go 10 and to try to go 10 on every single exercise all the time. That is just a recipe for trouble. That is, again, when we talk about managing stress of the young athlete, but also an older athlete, that is where we see problems overall. So yeah, approach tolerance, not threshold. That includes stretching too. At the bare minimum is where we're going to start. So if you can't do a barbell squat, then you're going to have to learn a bodyweight squat, and finding that minimal range of motion, whether it's squatting. If you can't squat to full range of motion, meaning the hips are equal in height and the femurs are parallel to the ground, it's the hips being equal to height as the knee joint, then we're going to have to find a way to get you down there. And that might be with assistance, that might be whatever, but we need to get you to a point of movement and then start there. And then we build on that. So again, the concept is start somewhere and build a baseline and then add range of motion first if you're lacking range of motion, and then add load. The other concept is that we do need ground and machine based. And machine in this instance is machines can sometimes get a bad rap within the industry, within people say, oh, you need functional training. Aren't machines bad for you? No, they train muscles, not necessarily movements. That's the thing that's been not the knock against them, is that they train muscles. But we sometimes need muscle hypertrophy in order to support a joint, in order to support posture, in order to support an athlete. So a machine-based exercise isn't inherently bad. And in parentheses here, we have closed and open chain exercises. What that means is, for instance, a barbell bench press is what's known as an open chain. Your hands are not in contact with the ground as you're doing the exercise, right? You're in contact with the bar. Your feet are, but that's different. On the flip side, if you're doing a push-up, that's known as a closed chain exercise. Another example is a leg press, which is an open chain exercise versus a closed chain exercise, which would be a squat. So closing the chain means that you're connecting to the ground versus the open chain is you don't have the connection to the ground for the working muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments, what have you. But the combination there is important. I wouldn't say to move all in one direction, but you can get away probably with more ground-based motions and closed chain exercises and say that you're only going to train that. But in identifying risk factors, some of the factors that can happen is that you only do one or the other. So make sure to have an open mind when it comes to ground-based and or functional training, kettlebells, dumbbells, barbells, and cables, and then also machine-based. They both have their place. Substitutions for travel. This is important. You're going on a family vacation, great. Get one workout in. That's it. You're going for 14 days, get 2 to 3, right? Make it simple for yourself. The concept of I'm going on vacation. Well, great. You're going to have probably the best food, probably the best sleep, probably the least amount of stress that you've had. Now would be a great time to work out. So many people are trying to take this time to just basically take the bumpers off and to just go bowling and throw the ball wherever they want to go. But sometimes having the bumpers in place can be very helpful to, even if you don't get a strike, you're more likely to knock some pins down and to keep the ball rolling. And the progress that you won't necessarily come from the vacation, but you won't necessarily feel like you have to get back on the horse after the vacation. And you're probably going to be more likely to continue as soon as you get back. A lot of people, the structured nature of their fitness plan is a good reminder for them, and they are eager to get back into the gym or the weight room or the personal training studio. The minimal commitment, I think this is important, and this is kind of the concept we just talked about for travel, but the minimal commitment, this is just a bare bones minimum. You need to strength train twice a week. The asterisk there is it needs to be 45 minutes. That's the minimal commitment. You have it. You have the time. You might not have the perfect gym setup. You might not have access to a Planet Fitness or a Club Fitness or 24-hour fitness or Anytime Fitness, and you might need to make your own home gym. Those are all things that you have at your disposal. And whether it's getting the weights and or the equipment secondhand from garage sales or from Facebook Marketplace or from Play It Again Sports or other resale options, there are options. And the more that you look for them, the more that your minimum commitment, which you set now, the minimum commitment towards that strength training routine is going to benefit you in the long haul. So again, looking at how this helps the young athlete, how this helps the aspiring pickleball or golf pro, not golf pro, but the golf club champ, all of these things play a role in that the minimum commitment is twice a week. Once a week, fine, you're not going to lose your gains, but the twice a week is really that magic number to keep the progress going forward. Exercises that we use, but this is not an exhaustive list by any means. Exercises that we use, okay? These are exercises that will help transfer to everyday life. So if you had to do just a few exercises, even bear crawls, if you talk about something you can do on the road, bear crawls, what a great exercise. You do quantifiably like laps on a beach or on a field. You did bear crawls, you would get tired from doing a proper bear crawl. Sled drags, these are also something that we reinforce at both gyms. Hangs, push-ups, squats, deadlifts, planks, dead bugs. All of these are things that, from a conceptual standpoint, we're teaching application and absorption of force. And within this concept, we have multiplanar training options, meaning we're not just training forward and back. We're not just training side to side. I look like I'm guiding a 737 in, and we're also training for rotation. So again, the concept here is that we're looking at how does this support your daily life, and or how does, in this instance, we're talking about exercises that we're doing to support your daily life. Whereas the whole time today, we've actually talked about exercises, your daily life supporting your exercise. So just kind of making sure that the tail wags the dog both ways here. This was a surprising stat for me. Now, we know the back pain number is higher than this. So 80% of people that have low back pain, 80% of people that have a actual MRI, and if we take that number and we say how many of those people actually have back pain, 80% don't. If they and 80% of those people have something going on at their back. Similarly, 36% of people who have rotator cuff tears, who are walking around with a rotator cuff tear, they don't have pain. So the reason this is so important, and this is the same for the back concept, is that pain is a lagging indicator. It usually happens after an injury. Now, again, we're not talking about an acute, meaning just happened, an ankle sprain, et cetera, or an elbow sprain or sprain your wrist. We're not talking about that. We're talking about pain being a lagging indicator for more repetitive stress injuries, the ones that we talked about before. And again, if you tear a rotator cuff, you might not need surgery. That's a crazy, crazy thing to say, but you might not need surgery. So again, the leading indicator, what can you do, talking about and going backwards onto the exercises we talked about. If you can't do some of those exercises, the question becomes, how do we get you to do them? Because then if we know that you do those exercises, then when you go to do your other exercises, pickleball, golf, tennis, baseball, softball, whatever, running, now you can participate in these sports that you previously couldn't. So again, when we talk about the rotator cuff, when we talk about the elbow, when we talk about anything that has to do with shoulders, it is imperative that we consider all these factors. And, I appreciate your time for today. I appreciate you thinking and maybe opening your mind to some of the other reasons behind and risk factors behind injuries. And again, the concept of predictable risk factors, I don't know that they're necessarily predictable. It's a great title, though. It gets you thinking. But the concept, again, for today is, what can we do outside of our activity that we love so much, the pickleball, golf, tennis, what have you? What can we do outside that sport? What can we do to support you as practitioners? What can we do to support you? What can you do to support your love and something that you probably spend a lot of time on? So please reach out if you have questions. Always there to lend an ear and eye and to listen to see what we can do to help as a practitioner, as a coach. And again, I hope this helps, and I look forward to presenting more of these in the future.